Strap in, dear listeners, because this may be our longest episode to date. Now, this conversation is with one of my dearest friends, Dr. Paul Tinari. But before I get into it, this episode is about circumcision, and it contains conversation, confrontation, science, and lived experience, as well as, personal opinions and concerning circumcision and the male penis, which might not be in alignment with your beliefs. It might be triggering for some, upsetting for others. And if that's the case, I just recommend, put this episode aside, you guys. Maybe listen to it another day. Or just skip it altogether, because it might be triggering, offensive, or disturbing to you. And Dr. Paul Tinari, he speaks largely towards statistics and his own experiences. And of course, I always speak from my own experiences. I just hope that, our internalized interpretation of what we have read, heard, and experienced ourselves, that it opens up your heart and your eyes to maybe some new thoughts, a new way of thinking. So again, if that isn't in your wheelhouse this week, this month, this year, that's cool, guys. Hit stop now. Wait for the next episode to pop out. But if this is in your wheelhouse, if you want to talk about squirting and circumcision and penises and, erectile dysfunction, any and all of that, we tackle that here in this conversation. We discuss Paul's own personal history as well, which might be triggering for some, which involves male rape and residential school for the Indigenous Métis population. Now, Dr. Paul Tinari, you guys, let's get into a little bit about Dr. Paul. Woo! He is an internationally renowned environmental and engineering consultant, a successful author, professional keynote speaker, consultant, human and organizational achievement and excellence coach. He also obtained his Ph.D. in fluid mechanics from the Von Karman Institute in Brussels, and his research involved developing the heat transport system for the NASA space station. Dr. Paul Tinari is also a statistical epidemiologist. You guys, he's just the coolest. I'm so excited for you guys to be getting to listen into a conversation that, I'm just so privileged to partake in whenever Paul is available to chat. And so without further ado, Dr. Paul Tinari is going to give us the goods, and I will catch you guys next week with a whole new episode.
Hi, Rayanne. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
Oh, so excited that you've come here today to speak. So I don't want to jump right in, and I have a tendency to just bulldoze over in these conversations. Can you just tell us, elaborate a little bit more on, what you've been up to, what your current titles mean for the rest of the world as far as the information that you're going to bring to us here today? And then we'll talk about how this came about and how you became so passionate on the subject matter of circumcision.
Okay, well, I have a very diverse background and I'm involved in a number of projects, but I'm going to focus on the projects that are relevant to the topic of this podcast today.
Beautiful.
And so as an epidemiologist, I've been conducting research over the last 30 years in many aspects of medicine, but I've focused on what I consider to be a very unstudied area, and that is the medical complications and implications of male infant circumcision. And so, for example, I was the first person to use the then new technology of functional MRI to look into the brain of the infant during a circumcision, so to see what would happen when the infant was exposed to the enormous pain of circumcision. And that had never been done before. Matter of fact, many doctors believe that infants didn't feel pain, would perform major surgeries on infants without giving them any pain relief. anyway, I showed using the functional MRI, which could look into the brain while we performed a circumcision, was that the infant felt extreme levels of pain. And this caused permanent alteration of the brain structure, especially in the parts of the brain connected with the emotion and deep thought, like the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. And what was really interesting is that when I wrote a paper on this, a scientific paper, and then when I tried to publish it, it was blocked. Why was it blocked? Because the hospital was making a huge amount of money performing circumcisions, and they didn't want their profit interrupted. And so they blocked the publishing of this paper. And that's when I realized medicine was hopelessly politicized. And that really activated me to become more and more active in this area of getting to the bottom of exactly the impacts of circumcision on ordinary people. And I was the first person to really study the impacts of male circumcision on female health and female sexual response, something that had never been written about before.
That is so fascinating. I want to jump back here to the way that babies and children feel pain, because I think it's important to note that men and women, that they have different brain sensitivities and to stress and conflict. And that men have 2.5 times the brain space devoted to the sexual drive and larger centers for action and aggression, but that they also have larger processors in the amygdala. And so what that means, for those of you listening, is that the fight and flight system of a child would be instantly activated during a circumcision. And that memory, correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, but that memory would be stored on a cellular level in the DNA, and that would cause a subconscious pattern that growing up as a man would create all kinds of complications.
Yeah, that's correct, Rayanne. That we're becoming more and more familiar with the concept of repressed memory, where people who were extremely traumatized as children repress the memory, but it comes back to haunt them later in life. Like, for example, I have two friends right now who were perfectly normal until their late teens. And then as they entered their 20s, they increasingly started to manifest the symptoms of touchophobia. It means they feared being touched. And two of these people that I know have not allowed themselves to be touched or intimate with anyone for 30 years because of this. And it was later discovered that they had repressed memories of abuse in their childhood that they'd hidden and not thought about. They'd repressed the memory, but it comes back to affect behavior later on in life. And so that's why it's important to address these hidden memories. But one of the things you can observe is that you'll have a lot of men who repress the anger they feel towards the mutilation of their body. And they'll say things like, oh, I'm circumcised and I'm perfectly happy that way. I'm going to circumcise my son. Now it's known by psychiatrists are now understanding that these types of statements are actually an expression of fear, of resentment, and denial. They're denying their own pain.
Well, they're normalizing it as a coping tool.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So the act of saying they're all right is actually saying they're not all right.
Right.
And see, who are they going to be angry at? Are they going to be angry at their mother who allowed them to be circumcised? No, they love their mother. So what do? Some men, let me stress some, not all, some men use their penis as a weapon to hurt the females in their life to get back at the female who hurt them, namely their mother. They don't want to take it out on their mother, so they take it out on their sexual partners. And I've interviewed thousands of women over the years trying to understand the psychology of the impacts of circumcision. And many women have testified, oh, he treats me like an object. He treats me like an oil well. He pounds away at me as if I'm an object. All these are symptoms of extreme anger that come from someone who's had an important body part removed without their consent.
I think it's really interesting, and I'm guilty of this, so that's partially why I'm bringing this up. But, when we think of the male penis, or at least when I thought of the male penis, I did not think of it as an organ outside the body. And organs are meant to be protected. And these organs, they have nerves much like the vagina, that they have nerves that run from these organs all the way to the brain. And then the brain interprets that information, and it gives us our view on reality around us. And so, I mean, when I think of the male penis now, after I've had many conversations, and I actually see that this organ is sitting there without any protection, and that it's laid completely exposed, the impact that would have long term on a man to have an organ that's meant to be protected on the outside, rubbing up against clothes, becoming desensitized, just the trauma that went into removing that foreskin, the long-lasting effects. I can absolutely see how some of the people that you have interviewed would not want people to touch them, and they would not want to expose themselves to that level of pain again.
Yes, that is true. In men who have come to terms with the reality of what happened to them, and they start expressing themselves truly, not in denial, then they all express resentment and anger that this was done to them without their consent. That it's one thing to have a body part changed or removed, like a woman who has a breast reduction. She's doing that with her consent, and she knows what the results are going to be. She knows that's what she wants. Right. So that's fine. But these infants are not consulted. They have a very important functional body part removed, which completely alters the functioning of a male. The penis is the essence of maleness. And so you've altered the functioning of the fundamental manifestation of maleness for the rest of that person's life. Not only does it affect him, but it also affects all of his future sexual partners. This is an incredible level of trauma, but the medical industry responds by trivializing this. And many people, unfortunately, have bought into this by trivializing the experience. Oh, it was just like cutting your nails. It was just a tiny piece of skin. It's just a little snip. It's nothing. It's not nothing. They removed 10 square inches of tissue, highly functional erogenous tissue with more than a mile of specialized nerves, with many glands that have specific functions in reproduction, more than a mile of blood vessels, which keep the head of the penis warm and protected, which is why the circumcised penis freezes so much faster in the wintertime than the intact penis. And as you so rightly observed, no woman would tolerate having the head of her clitoris rubbing against her clothing. But that's what she's going to do to her son by circumcising him, having the most sensitive part of his body rubbing against clothing for the rest of his life. Many men who were circumcised as adults say it's unbearable, the sensation of clothing touching their highly erogenous head of their penis, and it drives them absolutely insane. The foreskin is a function. Right. People would consider it insane if a doctor said, oh, if we remove your child's eyelids, we're going to improve his vision and make it less likely he's going to have eye infections. You'd think he was crazy, but that's exactly the same thing. An eyelid is almost identical to a foreskin, highly richly with many nerves protecting a mucous membrane, the eyeball, and with skin on the outside, mucous membrane on the inside, exactly like the foreskin. This is why foreskin can be used for eyelid reconstructive surgery. But yet people accept the fact by removing the foreskin, you improve a man's sexual experience. That's just as crazy as saying removing an eyelid improves a guy's eyesight. That's insane.
Well, I'd be curious to know about the effect that it has on a man's hormones. And just because, I mean, we all know that skin exposure to, different chemicals and to sunlight and to clothing, we're starting to learn more and more about what we put on our skin greatly affects our hormones. And of course, hormones, I mean, those determine and or guide like the nurturing, the sexual and aggressive behaviors in the human being itself. And so I wonder, what would be the long-term effect on our hormones for a man that has, had that foreskin removed versus a man that hasn't, and he's not as exposed to those chemicals and whatnot. I mean, do you have any information on that?
Yes, enormous amount of information.
Nice.
It's a complex question, and I'm very glad you brought it up, but I'll simplify it down for people who don't have the benefit of medical training. So I like to talk in metaphors, and that is that you have a rose bud, not a rose flower, rose bud. And the outer layers of petals protect the developing inner sexual part of the, remember that a flower is a sexual organ. right? And it contains the reproductive system of the plant. So the outer layers of the petals of the rose protect the inner layers that are very delicate. And if you try to force that flower to flower early by peeling back the petals, the result is a disaster. It never flowers properly. That's exactly what you're doing with an infant. The foreskin in the infant is tightly fused to the head of the penis. It's held by a membrane very similar to the membrane that holds the nail to the finger. So I challenge anyone to take a scalpel and shove it under their fingernail and lift up the fingernail. That's exactly what circumcision does. It cuts away the membrane, and that membrane can be considered the male hymen, the symbol of male virginity. They are essentially cutting away a man's virginity and separating that foreskin from the head of the penis. It's incredibly painful. It's even more painful than separating a nail from your finger. It's not surprising that in torture, they pull out people's fingernails. Well, if you want to torture a baby, you strip away their foreskin. It's exactly the same thing. It's human torture. And I experienced this myself at the age of 8. And I can tell you it's more painful than a kidney stone, which I've also had. The most painful experience of my life. And yet people trivialize it. Matter of fact, try to mention circumcision in any social group, and you'll get people smiling and laughing as if something funny has happened. This shows the degree to which it's been trivialized, laughing at the pain suffered by an infant. There could be no greater evil than that. Anyway, so you now have stripped away the protective foreskin. The foreskin has over a mile of blood vessels which feed the developing glands, the head of the penis. If you strip that away in an infant, the head of the penis never develops properly. It's lost its external supply of blood that comes from the foreskin. Wow. Right? And so this is why circumcised men have significantly smaller penises than intact men. This is a known statistical fact. And so I don't know any man that wants less penis. But the best, right? And yet this is normal in the United States, to assure that men's penises will never develop properly because they're stripped away of their nurturing blood supply.
Well, do you think though, and I ask this again just because I don't know, do you think that it's done? I mean, definitely it would not be done by parents if they had all this information that you're presenting. And I can't help but wonder if it's, more so that the organizations that harvest these, the foreskin, for medical purposes that make, that they cash in on this, if they're not capitalizing on, a value that was institutionalized through slavery and persecution as well as patriarchy, and if people had more information like what you're suggesting, or not suggesting, but what you have proven, if they wouldn't make different, healthier choices for their children themselves.
Definitely. Now, that's another complex question, but I'll answer it to the best of my abilities in simple form. Mm. The number one driver of circumcision in the United States is profit. The simplest possible way. And then, however, that's not an acceptable justification to give to parents. Like, you would never say to your parent, oh, I'm going to make a huge profit by selling your son's foreskin to a pharmaceutical. Aren't you looking forward to circumcising him? No, that's totally unacceptable. So what do they say? Oh, it's going to protect him from penis cancer. Oh, he'll have a cleaner penis. You want women to want to do oral sex on your son when he's older, don't you? Well, they won't do it if he has a foreskin. They say the most ridiculous things to justify what they're about to do, which is a criminal act. Mm. Now, there's one thing I forgot to say. You mentioned hormones, mm-hmm. And I wanted to touch on that subject before I answer the rest of your question. Hormones are vitally important here. Most people have no idea that the foreskin is not a piece of skin. It's a complex organ, as complex as a liver or a kidney. For example, there's cells within the foreskin whose only job is to bind with estrogen and other hormones from the partner during sexual intercourse. Those cells now interpret those hormones from the partner and then send appropriate signals to the testicles to modify the production of sperm to more closely match the unique characteristics of that partner. So women have different degrees of thickness of mucus, different acidity of the vagina, and so on and so on. Mm-hmm. The sperm has to adjust to these different conditions for every partner. And so there's a signaling mechanism that allows the sperm to be created differently, manufactured differently for each partner. And so when you strip away the foreskin, you've killed and destroyed this beautiful signaling mechanism. And therefore, this is the reason why infertility is epidemic in the United States among circumcised men, because they've lost the signaling mechanism. Now, in women, the signaling mechanism, just as an interesting similar situation, there's a signaling mechanism between your baby and the areola of your breast. The areola's function is to sample the mucus, the saliva of the baby, and to know at what stage that baby is in their development. Then signals are sent to the milk-producing glands to change the composition of milk to match the needs of the baby that day. So every single day, the composition of breast milk changes. Formula could never do this. Similarly, you cannot replace the signaling mechanism in the foreskin. Once it's stripped away, it's gone forever. And you have now deeply impacted a man's fertility. Now, we criticize the Nazis for working on ways to sterilize prisoners in concentration camps, and yet we're doing exactly the same thing here. We're not sterilizing them, but we're making them less fertile than they would have been because they've lost this beautiful, amazing signaling mechanism that most people don't have no idea even exists. Most doctors have never heard of this because it's not taught in medical school. The only thing, I took many medical courses when I was an epidemiology student with the medical students, and I was shocked to hear that the only thing that most medical students hear about the foreskin is its removal. They know nothing else about it. So it'd be like saying the only thing you know about the heart is that it beats. That would be a criminal to have a cardiologist and say, oh yeah, you have a beating heart. That's all I know about it. That's all they know about the foreskin.
Well, and hormones, they play such one of the most important roles in how we see the world around us and how we interact with it. And, it's funny because you're saying this, which is interesting. When I was being sex trafficked, one of the number one steadfast rules was obviously condoms, but also that you did not kiss the John or the trick. And, right. And one of the things that I discovered later on is that when you kiss somebody, that the saliva carries in it, information that tells us whether or not that as a couple we can copulate and produce significant offspring. And so it's interesting to me that the hormones back and forth, that this knowledge out there about kissing is very, it's there for anybody to find it. And yet the knowledge about the penis and the importance of the foreskin in the production of hormones that allows a man and woman to mate and to produce the strongest offspring, that information would be hidden. And not only that there's this huge question looming right now, and I can't remember where I read it from, but that birth rates have slowed down and that there has been discussion as to, why that is. And yes, many people are deciding not to have children right now because they have a lot more rights and responsibilities available to them. But also that in part that could be largely considered due to circumcision and, the inability to produce the sperm that would otherwise, match up with the female's body to ensure that.
That's a very good point, Rianne. I can talk medically. I can't talk about the psychology of people choosing not to have children, but what I can talk about is what I observe medically. And that is that if you look at a graph of circumcision rates as a function of time, going from the 1800s when it was like 5%, going right up to the 1970s when it reached an amazing 90% in the United States, which is incredible for cosmetic surgery that reached 90%. Wow. It just shocks me. But if you now plot a graph on the same time scale of the number of sperm per cubic milliliter of semen,
Okay.
You see that the highest levels were in the 1800s, and they fall in lockstep with circumcision rates. So as circumcision rates rise, the concentration of sperm per milliliter of sperm falls and reaches its minimum in the 1970s. So by removing this beautiful signaling mechanism, like I said, you now deeply impacted a man's fertility, because a man needs a certain concentration of sperm in order to successfully impregnate a woman. Yes, it takes one sperm to penetrate the egg, but it takes billions of sperm to help that one sperm get there. And so if you don't have enough helping sperm, then that one sperm never makes it to the egg, and you have an infertility problem. And
Wasn't
so
circumcision, wasn't it used as a method of keeping the slavery or slaves in check as far as population goes?
well,
Back say 5,000 to 7,000 years ago.
so now we're going into the history of circumcision, which will be interesting to many of our listeners.
Mm-hmm.
The first recorded reference to circumcision is found on Egyptian tomb paintings, where they clearly show Egyptians circumcising slaves to brand them as slaves.
Okay.
Now, why would they do that? Well, for one, it's an easy thing to do. You pull a man's foreskin, you cut it off with a knife. It's done in a few seconds. And excellent. Now, why would they do that in particular? Why don't they just cut off an ear or a finger or something? Well, it's because in the ancient world, a long tapered foreskin was considered the height of male beauty. So if you go to a museum and look at the Greek statues, all of the males have long tapered foreskins. It was considered very beautiful, very sexually desired. So women would seek men with the longest foreskins because they're so beautiful. And so by amputating a man's foreskin, you now made him ugly to females and to society in general. And so by amputating a slave's foreskin, you now branded him permanently for the rest of his life as a slave. And secondly, you made him highly undesirable. And thirdly, you dramatically reduced his sexual response so that he could more follow your orders and have less interest in the female slaves to mate with, so that you've accomplished three things with one simple procedure. And so we now go to the 1800s, when for some ridiculous reason, Victorian doctors believed that masturbation was the greatest evil that a person could do. I don't know how this idea came. Maybe it came from the Christian ideal that if something is pleasurable, it must be sinful. Yeah.
Well,
Anyway,
dominance ultimately, right?
Yes, that's right. So then we have Dr. Kellogg in the late 1800s, who brought all this to a head, and he wrote medical papers. You can still access these papers in the journals at the time, where he didn't use the word masturbation. He used self-destruction or self-abuse, and he said it was the greatest destroyer of humanity. And so he vowed to stamp it out. And what he observed as a doctor was that his Jewish patients who had been circumcised suffer from numerous sexual dysfunction problems, such as premature ejaculation, inability to achieve erection, and so on. And for him, this was highly desirable. So he said, well, geez, we can induce all of these medical problems in young boys by circumcising them, so they'll be less prone to masturbate and focus on their Christian studies and reading the Bible instead of masturbating. So he advocated a very, very painful circumcision. He actually used the word as painful as possible to have a salutary effect on the mind so that people would be less interested in sex. For girls, he enthusiastically encouraged parents to burn off their daughter's clitoris with carbolic acid. And that was considered legal until the 1920s. But the reason male circumcision wasn't banned at the time, and it continued, because it was highly profitable. And secondly, they could it maintained the patriarchy, the power of the patriarchy to impose pain on children, and because of the profit motive, they kept inventing new justifications for it. So when masturbation became a ridiculous justification with the more sophisticated populations of the 1920s, they said, oh, it'll prevent tuberculosis, which was the big disease then. Then in the 1950s, they said, oh, it'll prevent polio. And then in the 1960s, it was preventing STDs. Then in the 1980s, it was preventing HIV. And to this day, you have billions of dollars being wasted by the World Health Organization on a useless circumcision campaign in Africa, which will not save a single life. Matter of fact, it'll kill many people.
I was just going to say, I wouldn't say that it was purposeless. I would say that there's no profit in communal existence, right? And so,
yeah.
Competing world powers, I mean, this is the current leaders are just exploiting the conditions that patriarchy enabled, 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, right?
You're right.
Let's get to the real heart of the conversation there. I mean, an anti-sexual religious morality, I mean, it's just the result of long conditioning process, Yes,
as a woman, Rayanne, you can appreciate it was the patriarchy that introduced foot binding in China 1,000 years ago, right? Where thousands and thousands and thousands, millions of Chinese girls were crippled by having their feet broken and bound, essentially rendering them helpless, almost unable to walk without the help of crutches or canes. And this was done purely for male gratification because the foot was sexualized in ancient China. And so I contend that foot binding is the patriarchal attitudes that led to foot binding are exactly the same attitudes that lead to male infant circumcision in our society, that the attitudes are the same. Now, the Communist Party came into power in the late 1940s, and they realized they couldn't have millions of women unable to work and planting rice. It just wasn't feasible to have all these people who were unable to work. So they banned foot binding, right? And fortunately, they did. However, parents were so adamant to continue doing it that they kept doing it. Eventually, the Communist Party introduced a death penalty for any parent that bound their child's feet. Thousands and thousands of parents were put against the wall and shot. That's what it took to stop it. I really, really hope that we don't have to resort to that to stop circumcision in North America, that we can do it peacefully, that parents will come to their senses and realize that it's not such a good idea to torture their child in the name of aesthetics or whatever other justification that the medical industry has put before them.
Well, I think that there's so many different directions we could take this conversation. And like right now, I mean, there's about 7 different topics that I want to jump into. But, I want to start off with saying that, I think that the first step to ending this practice is, number one, obviously awareness, which is, why we have you on the podcast today. But, I also want to bring up, I mean, the hypersexualization goes both ways in both men and women. And that the hypersexualization is a result of fracturing a human into, separating the body, mind, and spirit 100%. And, when we hypersexualize the body, I think that that's something that needs to be really addressed, is the unrest and the uneasiness of our souls in general, and the energy that resides within us, because we're trying to attain this perfection that we're told, because we're told, I think, and from a religious standpoint, I can't speak on all religions, but some of the religions I've read up on, that we are born in sin. And so we're constantly trying to correct to achieve this perfection. And yet the human body is so magnificent. I mean, we're still just discovering things that we didn't know, that they didn't have the information, 150 years ago, like what you're presenting today, which is that the human penis is an organ on the outside of the body that needs its protection. And it needs its protection because it's specifically designed to interact with the female. And it is the essence of, the spirit of the male. And I think that would be really good to jump into right now, how the male penis interacts with the female vagina, in a sense of the eroticism behind it, let's jump into the Gspot and, the male orgasm, if you don't mind going there with me.
So before I answer that question, you raised a number of points I just wanted to quickly address.
Yeah.
The hypersexualization, yes.
Yes.
There's some women that I've interviewed. I've interviewed over 30,000 people over the last 35, 40 years on the topic of circumcision.
Okay.
To inform myself about why people have done this to their children. And some women say, I like the look of the circumcised penis. Let's analyze that statement. The only time that a male's glands or head of his penis is visible is during erection, arousal.
Right.
The foreskin retracts and the formerly protected head of the penis is now exposed and is ready for interacting with the vagina.
Right.
Okay. So that means that the head of the penis is only visible during sexual arousal. So when you say that you prefer the look of the circumcised penis, it means that you want a baby to appear sexually aroused all the time. So in other words, you're a pedophile. Like, I hate to put that label, but that's exactly what they're saying. I like to sexualize a baby. I want my baby to look sexualized. I want them to look aroused all the time. It's evil. So we have to put the proper labels on things. People are really pussyfooting around the issue, but I'm not scared to label things as they are. Someone who runs a concentration camp is evil. They are anti-human. Someone who circumcises a baby because they like the look of the circumcised penis is a pedophile. They have sexualized an infant, which is evil. Under any other context, interacting sexually with an infant would get you put in jail. But in this one instance of circumcision, people are allowed to sexualize their children legally.
Well,
and
it's interesting though,
evil.
Because I don't believe that many people understand that subconsciously that that's what's taking place either. They prefer the look. This is what has been, maybe it's from a religious standpoint, maybe it's because it's what they were taught, maybe it's because, as a woman, then they think about the male penis, it is an attractive organ. Similar to me, the way that beauty pageants take place, where they have you sexualize these little 8 to 12-year-olds and put them in
exactly.
But
many of them not even consenting. Yes.
Yeah, but I think that rather than attacking people and saying this is what you're doing, I think it's important that we say, we're working hard to change the language and the perception and the reality of this. And that if somebody chooses to become circumcised, then, they need to be of a consenting age. Because let's look at clitorization or clitorism and the defibrillation? No, sorry, fibrillation.
Fibrillation.
Thank you. You know what I was trying to say.
Yes.
That has been brought to an end worldwide. Well, I think it does still happen in Africa a little bit. And you cannot consent to that. And so I see no difference between, I don't think that we should condemn people's attachment to it, because an attachment, I think that's something that other people need to work through on their own. I don't think that we can tell people that they have the right to do with their own body whatever they want to do, right? I think that people should have that right. Agency is important. You should be able to say no, but you should also be able to say yes. And so that's why I think, let's change the language around it and say, listen, if you feel really strongly and really passionate about this for yourself, then yeah, when you're of an age, definitely you should go get that done. When there's, when you can be put under and it can be done medically where it's not an extreme trauma. But 100%, you shouldn't have the right to do that to your child. But then that would also bring up the argument potentially for a bunch of other things that parents do on their child's behalf. I mean, it's unfortunately, it is a slippery slope in the sense that it raises.
Can I address that what you just said? That's a very important point. The things that parents consent to do on their children.
Yeah.
Virtually nothing that a parent may want to do for their daughters is legal. You cannot circumcise a daughter. You cannot bind her feet. You cannot mutilate her body. You cannot trim her labia. Anything that cultures around the world regularly do to their daughters is legal in North America for daughters. Yeah. So why is it that parents have a choice on their sons to circumcise or not, but they do not have the choice for their daughters? That's hypocrisy at the highest level, right? And it's something that should be addressed. It's an imaginary choice created by the circumcision industry. Mm-hmm. And, addressing the point you made before is that everything is driven by profit,
right?
By convincing parents of infants to circumcise, they get a foreskin, which is actually more useful for the pharmaceutical industry. The infant foreskin is much richer endowed in stem cells and other useful materials that are useful from the pharmaceutical industry, whereas an adult's foreskin has less stem cells and is less useful for pharmaceuticals. Second point is that if you have a group of intact men, less than 1 out of 1,000 will choose circumcision later in life. 1 out of 1,000, that's 0.1%. Now compare that with the 90% of circumcision that was forced on males as infants. So you see, they know that if you don't get that infant circumcised, he will never choose circumcision later on. So they're desperate to do anything to convince the parents to circumcise his infants, because they know once that window of opportunity is gone, it's gone forever.
Let's jump into that here for a second. Let's talk about why circumcision is a valuable medical material.
Okay, because one thing I just mentioned, it contains stem cells, which are really useful in a whole types of research. For example, there's research going on in limb regeneration. We know that there's lizards and amphibians that can regrow their limbs when they lose them, their tails, their legs, and so on. We are desperate to try and figure out how they do that. And the way to do that is to start with stem cells that can be programmed to become any cell of the body and learn how these animals regenerate their limbs from stem cells. And we'd like to do that. It would be wonderful if a man lost his leg in war, he could regrow his leg. So there's valid research being done with stem cells, and foreskins are the richest source of stem cells you can get. Secondly, it's used to make a product for burn patients, synthetic skin, which is a very valuable material. Thirdly, it's used for making beauty products. If you've used a beauty product containing elastin, there's only one source on earth for elastin. It's male foreskins that have been taken from the individual without consent. So after the Second World War, there were laws passed, international treaties for make it impossible to do again what the Nazis had done, to commercialize human beings. People might remember that they used to make lamps out of human skin. They used to take hair from prisoners and stuff them in pillows. They used to do illegal medical experiments on prisoners. They used to pull out their teeth for the gold. This grotesque exploitation of human beings. After the war, treaties were signed, including by Canada and the United States, forbidding the trafficking of human beings or the products of human beings. And yet, here we have infant circumcision, which is taking useful, functional tissue from a non-consenting person and commercializing it. This is a form of human trafficking at its most grotesque, and it's trivialized by the medical industry. And matter of fact, most parents are not even aware that this is done, that the tissue is going to be sold at great profit. So they've actually bought into the corporate agenda that parents are now active participants in commercializing their infants, and they don't even know it, most of them.
Isn't there a circumcision fetish organization that was recently charged with?
Every form of pedophilia has been banned, fortunately, in North America. So you cannot legally indulge in any type of sexual activity with a child. It doesn't matter what kind of fetish you have, whether it's touching a little girl's hair or playing with her feet or touching her vagina. It's all been banned, fortunately, right? There's one exception. There is a type of fetish called circumsexuality, where people are sexually aroused by everything concerning circumcision, watching circumcisions, drinking blood from circumcisions, touching the circumcised penis, fondling the child during circumcision. Everything concerning circumcision has been sexualized. And there's websites devoted to circumsexuality where they have videos of painful circumcision, and they have videos, pictures of amputated foreskins, which are considered highly erotic to these people. Now, what is really disgusting about this, it's legal. This is one aspect of pedophilia which is legal. It is legal to circumcise a child for sexual purposes, for gratification of adults. And this has to stop.
That's overwhelming. you know.
Yes. Now, well, I want to make a comment.
Yeah.
You're familiar with Bernstein,
Yeah.
who allegedly committed suicide in jail?
Yes. I'm
Well,
actually currently watching the Netflix show about him. So yeah.
Yeah, his files have been found, and they contain the names of thousands and thousands of celebrities, high-level political figures, even the royal family of England, right?
Mm-hmm.
People who went to his island and had sex with underage girls, and also engaged in the circumcision of infants for their own sexual gratification. There's videos of this, right?
Oh.
Now the names are all there in his notebooks and records of these who did this, and there's thousands and thousands of people who've taken advantage of the fact that circumcision remains legal to engage in sexual gratification involving the torture of children.
That is, I mean, actually, I think that this is, well, again, it still remains overwhelming to me. I mean, I can't imagine. And yet at the same time, you know, I can, because I look at it also as in the people that are engaging in this type of pedophilia, I look at it as a cyclical cycle too. And it makes me curious about the imprint of trauma on the brain, especially taking place, you know, at these young ages, the subconscious patterns that hold, you know, throughout our lifetime, and that then, you know, push people towards, you know, perpetuating the cycle and abusing others as they were abused, or as maybe they subconsciously retained that abuse and are, you know, moving forward with it in different ways. I mean,
yeah. Okay. Let me answer that question. Let me stress before I give an answer that I'm talking to the millions of circumcised men out there. Just because you're circumcised doesn't mean you're become an abuser. Doesn't mean you're going to be violent, right? We're talking statistically now.
Yes.
Let's look at the statistics. Take a country like Norway, a relatively peaceful country, right? Circumcision is only about 0.1% of the men in Norway are circumcised. And yet 95% of the rapes in Norway are committed by circumcised men. That's a pretty frightening statistic, one that's suppressed in our society. In other words, they don't keep rape statistics according to circumcision status. Now, is it the fault of those men? Yeah, well, they're the ones who raped. But let's step back. What happened to them? Well, they were violently circumcised, huge amount of pain imposed on them. They were brain damaged by this. Yeah. And some men, and notice I use the word some, not all, some men will respond in adulthood with violence.
Right. No, I mean, that's, I study the brain. I'm not, obviously I'm not a doctor. I'm not a psychologist. I like to learn about things, especially given my own trauma history. And that's what makes me curious about it, because there was a time, and I've spoken about this before, but there was a time when rape turned me on, and it frightened me. You know, it frightened me a lot. And it wasn't until I learned about the amygdala, and I learned about our fight or flight responses, and I learned about PTSD that I began to understand that more, that how, you know, these simulations could produce a physiological response from me, that my brain was freaked out about, that, but that my body responded to, right? And so that's what kind of brought me into the conversation concerning, you know, this early childhood trauma, you know, and just perpetuate in that same cycle of abuse and the way that we act out upon that. And, you know, I'm also curious about the relationship between, you know, the early men tribalism, the way that, you know, men initiate other men is to separate that bond between the mother and the son, the children. And, you know, it kind of, to me, it brings up questions, and it brings up, I make these connections in my head where I go, well, that's also really similar, in my opinion, to the way that we've separated from the planet Earth, and the way that and again, I'm not trying to pick on religions. It's just that, you know, religion and colonialism and imperialism, to me, they're all connected. And, you know, the way that patriarchy stepped in some 7,000 years ago goes all the way back to, you know, Crete and Dionysus and just a bunch of other things to do with the Greeks. And the separation of men from the goddess religion and the creation of a not a deity, but a male supreme God that rules in the sky, that we are separate, apart from, versus being a part of the Mother Earth, brings into question for me that also, would it stand to reason that there would be kind of ritualism behind the original early circumcisions in relation to creating a painful association of the penis with sexuality and with the female mother, that would perpetuate that cycle and continue to cause a divide, and therefore, in my eyes, I would view a more readily understand or acceptance of early slavery, because ultimately women really were the first slaves. At least according to the archaeological findings that I have read about.
Yeah, just a quick comment that let me also stress historically that the Romans and the Greeks understood the damage that circumcision did to the penis, and so throughout the Roman Empire, circumcision was banned by ancient Rome, right? And this is where the big conflict occurred between the Roman Empire and Judea, was over circumcision.
Well, I was going to say, isn't that really interesting? Because we were talking about Egypt earlier, and I believe, what was it, when paganism was ruled out? I think it was that's when they introduced Christianity to Egypt, and so that's confusing. Can you explain more about, I don't know if you know more about that on that end, where paganism was still a part of the Roman culture, and so I'm assuming that circumcision would have been disallowed in that.
Let me repeat what I said before. Yeah. In the ancient world, the long tapered foreskin, the intact penis was considered the height of beauty.
Right.
So after the death of Jesus, right? Remember, Jesus was a Jew, right? And his early followers were all Jews, so they were all circumcised. Right?
Okay.
Now, the Apostle Paul, when he started giving talks about Christianity, realized that Christianity would never get any traction in the Roman Empire. No, it would get no converts if Romans had to circumcise themselves because of the hatred for the circumcised penis.
Right.
So Paul emphasized in his speeches that circumcision was not, I repeat, not necessary to become a Christian. If you read the Gospels, like his Gospels to the Corinthians or to the various speeches he gave, he says Christianity demands circumcision of the heart, not of the body.
Oh,
right?
Interesting.
And by this way, many, many Romans embraced Christianity who otherwise wouldn't have, because of the hatred for the circumcised penis. You see? So the bottom line is, right from its early establishment, Christianity did not demand circumcision as a requirement for membership.
Oh, yeah. See, I did not know that. That's really interesting.
Yeah. So today we see what really bothers me is the hypocrisy of many people. Like, for example, like I said, I've interviewed thousands of parents over the years, and there was one woman who was a believer in everything she did was organic and wholesome and natural. And she did not vaccinate her child because vaccines were abnormal, were not natural. But what did she do? She circumcised her baby. Well, I said, that's pretty irrational. That's nothing natural about it. And she couldn't explain why she had done it. She just it's a reflex action. And you see, there's this type of hypocrisy all the time concerning circumcision, irrationality.
Well, I mean, is it hypocrisy, or is it just historically ingrained feature? I mean,
it's a paradigm, and the paradigm is really hard to escape from, as difficult as it is for a fish to escape from water. The paradigm is all over you, all around you, and it's accepted as normal. To a Roman, if you said, it's not such a nice thing to keep slaves, he would look at you as if you were crazy, going, I've always had slaves. My great-grandfather had slaves. We've always had slaves. There's nothing wrong with it, right? In all the writings of the ancient Greeks, the Greeks were the rational people of the ancient world, with Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, all these rational people. If you look at their writings, not a single person in ancient Greece ever questioned slavery. No one ever said, this is not such a good idea to enslave people.
That's right.
It wasn't until the modern world in the 1800s, 1700s, we started to question slavery. And a war was fought in the United States over slavery because the paradigm was so deeply ingrained. Today, fortunately, no one would dream of owning a slave. We've changed the
I'm going to
paradigm.
back you up there because slaves are still owned all over the world.
Not in Canada, fortunately, and not in the United States.
Well, it's illegal, but it's still taking place.
Of course. There's many things that are illegal that are taking place.
Yeah.
Like, for example, everything that happened to you, Rayanne, as when you were younger, as being trafficked, was illegal, but it still happened.
Well,
right?
and it still happened, and the cops were a part of it. And so,
Corruption. But the difference that I'm talking about here, but hypocrisy, fortunately, everything that happened to you was illegal and there are laws against it. But what I'm arguing is that circumcision is particularly evil because it's legal. It's legal to torture a child. It's legal to do circumcision for hate purposes. It's legal to do it for sexual purposes. All that is legal.
Well, I think it's important to bring up, we're essentially wired for oppression at this point in time. I mean, if you're looking at this from an epigenetical standpoint, there's so many generations of trauma that have been passed down without proper acknowledgement or healing because most of us are just in survival mode. And when you're in survival mode, no one really stops. They don't have time to stop and question these things that are actually damaging us. They're just trying to get to one moment to the next, and they're not putting a lot of thought into the damage that they're doing to themselves. I think it's no different than, if we talk about, we could literally put our nutrition instead of circumcision in this case and say, like, when we eat certain foods that are being fed to us by the government, not the government, but by certain food agencies, they have scientists, doctors in a lab growing taste buds, and they're growing these taste buds in order to study whether or not these taste buds can become addicted to certain chemicals, and then they're allowed to sell that food. And I think that, it's to me, that smacks similarly of what's happening with circumcision, which is that the doctors are allowed to, tell you all this stuff in order to sway your decision in their favor for their own, in order to make money, essentially, is kind of what
you're making a lot of really, really good points there, Rayanne. One of them I'd like to address is the marketing of circumcision.
Yes.
The retiring head of the business faculty at Harvard in his retirement party was asked by a student, sir, what do you think is the best marketing campaign that's ever been launched in the United States? And people expected him to say, oh, it's Johnson & Johnson or Procter & Gamble. But no, he said, in my opinion, the American circumcision industry has created the most powerful, the most effective marketing campaign ever developed in history, because they convinced 100 million families to do something they knew was harmful to their child and convinced them that it was good. And this is the incredible evil, to convince an entire country to do harm.
I think this is a perfect opportunity, not to change the subject, but actually to shift into your own personal history, because you do say the word evil a lot, and I'd like to address that. And I believe the reason that you use the word evil and you're so passionate about it is because of the effects that circumcision had upon you. And as you had mentioned previously, that you are Métis.
A Métis is someone who has Indian blood. It could be 1/4, 1/2, or 3/4.
Yeah. So like I myself, I am Métis, but also the history on it, the right words don't always find me when I want them to. So, I mean, for Canada, many people don't know that Canada was actually formed upon the ethnic cleansing and genocide by the federal government. And it was actually, the federal government funded these residential schools, but the residential schools were operated by the Anglican, Catholic, United Methodist, and Presbyterian churches. And that children that were a part of these residential schools, they were forced to adhere to European societal and cultural norms. And one of the cultural norms was punishment for anything to do with sexuality, such as masturbation. But it was also used as a controlling and a way to dismantle the indigenous culture and population. It was a genocide at the time. And Can you tell us more about your experience with the residential school? Because there's not very many people who are willing and able to speak up, such as you are, on the matter.
Yes, so let me just specify that my grandfather was an Abenaki shaman, and I was probably one of the last people indoctrinated in the shamanic traditions. So I hold the last of the Abenaki knowledge of shamanism.
Wow.
Unfortunately, my children didn't want to learn it, so the information will die with me unless I find students to teach. So it's unfortunate. The Abenaki were located in eastern Quebec, in part of the Maritimes, in New Hampshire, Vermont, that area. And they were once a very powerful tribe. As a matter of fact, they're mentioned in the movie Last of the Mohicans as one of the powerful tribes, along with the Algonquin, the Huron, and the Ottawa. And they were hereditary enemies of the Iroquois Confederacy, and we were at war with them quite often. Anyway, so the Abenaki came into contact with the whites quite early in the 1600s, and they were decimated by disease. So the population went from probably 50,000 down to maybe 5,000. So decimation by disease. And since it was an oral culture, you had many of the elders who held the traditional knowledge dying off without leaving any records. And so you can imagine entire peoples being decimated of their traditional knowledge. Mm-hmm. At least in white culture, they had books. So if a learned person dies, they can go and read their writings and their notebooks to find out what they knew. But we didn't have that benefit. Anyway, because of the massive die-off of natives in the 16, 17, 1800s, all native policy in Canada was designed with the assumption that natives would disappear and become such a minority in the population, they would not be an issue. So all policy was based on that. So that gives you an understanding of why the policy is a bit weird, because natives refused to die off, and so they really didn't know what to do about it. One of the things they tried to do was take the Indian out of the Indian and make him white. And the way they did that was to essentially kidnap native children and force them into residential schools run by the churches. Essentially, you had Lord Acton's comment acting in full force. Lord Acton said, "All power corrupts, but absolute power corrupts absolutely." The priests and ministers and pastors within these schools had absolute power to do anything they wanted, even kill students if they so desired and get away with it. And so they acted like anyone with absolute power. They exercised their power. And there was it's a perfect example of the patriarchy. To this day, I have mostly female friends, because the people who were kind to me in the residential schools were the nuns and the females, whereas I was always oppressed by males and beaten and sodomized and raped and every possible abuse, punched and beaten and locked up in closets. And as a result, I find it very difficult to make friendships with men. That's how one way it's affected me. Mm-hmm. Now, let's go back to the fundamentals here. In native religious lore, the foreskin is seen as the seat of spirituality in the male. That is where male power resides. And this is why during many native religious ceremonies, the foreskin was pierced with a thorn and a blood offering was given to the Great Spirit as a sacrifice. And so you can see that when the missionaries came, they understood that the foreskin was critical to native spirituality. And so they targeted the foreskin for particular abuse. And by introducing circumcision to native tribes, they disconnected them from their whole religious heritage, making it impossible to do their religious ceremonies. So in the religious residential schools, they use circumcision as punishment. So in my case, I was a happily intact boy until I was 8. And then I was put into residential school in grade 2. And one of the other boys accused me of masturbating. It was a lie. He was just trying to get revenge for some other slight. And so the priest acted upon this, because masturbation was the greatest evil, right? We're all going to go to hell if we masturbate. So that means everybody's going to go to hell. There's a statement that there's 2 types of people: those who masturbate and those who lie about it. Anyway, so one night 2 priests came and pulled me out of bed and dragged me into a room where there was a third man waiting. And I know that he was Jewish because he had a concentration camp number on his arm. And I remember he was wearing a beanie cap, which religious Jews wear. And he had a very thick black beard. And they held me down on the desk and tried to circumcise me. Now, that's when I realized why they circumcise infants, because infants can't fight back. They're helpless. But older children can fight back. So I kicked one priest in the face. It was very satisfying, tell you. And I bit the other one who was trying to hold me down. Anyway, they responded by breaking my arm and breaking my nose, which they thought was quite funny. And then when they had subdued me, they then proceeded with no anesthetic, no disinfection of any type, just to hack off my foreskin as roughly as they could. And they thought this was just so funny, hilarious. Because I was a complete at their whim and beck and call. I could not do anything to fight this. Anyway, for the rest of my childhood, I suffered from endless infections, weeping, infected wounds, painful erections, bent penis. And let me stress, a bent penis is called Peyronie's disease, and it's uniquely in circumcised men. Something that medicine doesn't mention, that circumcision is the cause of Peyronie's disease. It's not something you're born with. It never occurs in intact men. It's only in circumcised men. When the circumcision scar heals unevenly, you get a bent penis. And this can be so serious that in some men, the penis actually turns 180 degrees and points back at the body, making intercourse impossible.
Wow.
These complications are never mentioned in the medical literature as complications of surgery. And I estimate the complication rate is 36%, the highest of any surgery. We'll talk about that later. Anyway, so when I was 18, I went to the police and I told them this was in French, of course, that I deserved it. Being Native, I was just being disciplined, and that was perfectly legal. At that moment, I was determined to fight the system and to get justice. So as I gained more knowledge of the system, I launched a class action lawsuit on behalf of all the residential school students against the federal government, which had licensed these schools, and the churches which ran them. And it took 26 years to run through the courts. Eventually, under the Harper government, it was settled for $3.2 billion, which were distributed to I believe it was 14,000 survivors of residential school. And with my portion, I got restoration surgery. I had my foreskin restored, and I lived part of my life as an intact man, part as a circumcised man, and the rest as an intact man. And I can tell you, intact is infinitely superior. I can also talk about my first sexual experience after I had my foreskin restored. My partner had a Gspot orgasm, which had never happened to me before, and that's when I realized the function of the foreskin is vital for female sexual response. I now know that a woman is 10 times more likely to have an orgasm during intercourse with an intact man than a circumcised man. Of course, for religions, this is highly desirable because they don't want women to enjoy sex, because female sexuality is considered evil among many cultures. Similarly, this impacts female health on a number of ways. One is the pain during sex, that the circumcised penis is unlubricated, and if a woman doesn't lubricate enough, she's going to have painful sex, which is not conducive to wanting to have sex with your partner.
Right.
Secondly, it has a deeper impact on female health, and that is that females are equipped with Skene's glands and Barlothrope glands that are triggered from the Gspot. And the Gspot is stimulated by alternating pressure, not friction. The circumcised penis can only deliver friction. Therefore, it's useless for triggering Gspot orgasms. However, the retracting foreskin presses directly on the Gspot alternately as the man moves in rhythm with the woman during intercourse, thereby triggering Gspot response, thereby allowing the woman to purge toxins out of her body through lymph purging. So there's a whole system here which medicine knows very little about, which depends on having an intact partner. So when I lived in Europe, I was amazed that most women had Gspot response and regular lymph purging because all their partners are intact. At the same time, this was almost unknown in North America. So that women are being toxified because their partners are unable to trigger the available detoxification systems that nature has equipped them with.
Well,
So once again, another signaling system that's been destroyed.
I was just going to interrupt you to say, let's just expand on that just a little bit for our listeners. Because I've experienced this. This is something that you do teach people how to do for themselves in order to purge the lymphatic system. But let's talk about the purge of the lymphatic system, what the porn culture has referred to as squirting. That's not a response, like that's not cum, that's lymphatic fluid. Am I correct?
Well, it is the Gspot orgasm is an orgasm, just like a clitoral orgasm.
Yes.
But it results in different degrees of ejaculation. So women can ejaculate just like men can.
Right.
Degrees. Some women just drip a little bit. Other women can spray right across the room. Both are healthy. Both are healthy and normal. But that's a lymphatic purging. That's not cum. Is that correct? Well, it's female cum. Right. No, the composition of the material is lymphatic system containing traces of toxins that are being removed from the body. Yeah. So no, it's not semen, it's lymph. You're right. Yeah, it's lymph fluid. And I bring that up because I hear lots of people, that joke about it. They don't understand what squirting is. I hear so many women. When I heard of squirting, I was like, yeah, that's never happened to me before. And I've heard, comedians like, Whitney Cummings makes a joke about, can she squirt? Fuck no, she can't squirt, kind of thing. And knowing what I know, I was like, oh, actually, we should insert that squirting is a natural physiological release of toxins. And it's an important thing that needs to take place because, without that, the lymphatic buildup can cause a lot of problems for people. Yeah. So let me just stress that every woman on earth is born with Skene's glands and Bartlett throat glands that are designed for no other purpose but to ejaculate lymph. That's their function. So why would nature equip women with these glands unless they were meant to be used, right? However, it was noted that when you circumcise a man, women do no longer have Gspot response. And since all female sexual response was considered evil and unladylike, they consider that a desirable result. But I assure you, it undermines female health. My research has indicated a number of things. Like I did research where I studied bodies coming into a funeral home. I had a friend who was working in a funeral home, and she allowed me to do some research. And this had never been done before. Let me stress that as an epidemiologist, the judgment of the efficacy, how good a surgery is by its effect on life expectancy. So if you do a particular cancer surgery like a lumpectomy and compare it to a radical mastectomy, you look at the life expectancy after the surgery. What produces the longer life expectancy? That's how you choose which surgery to do. I know a study has never been done on the effect of circumcision on life expectancy. Really? Well, I decided to do one. So I decided to observe cadavers coming into a funeral home, see if they were circumcised or not, look at their medical records and see were they smokers, were they drinkers, whatever, eliminate the people who died in accidents and look at the people who died of so-called natural causes like heart attacks and so on. And after studying several thousand cadavers, I found an amazing 2.5-year difference. Circumcised men live on average 2.5 years less than intact men. And once again, I was never allowed to publish my results because you're not allowed to publish anything that would threaten the circumcision industry. But that's amazing discovery. And yet I can't publicize it. Isn't it true that a man that has been circumcised, that they lose feeling as they age in the penis, like overall, and it decreases their sexual desire, right? Well, that's a very, very good point. And once again, it's a complex answer, and I'll simplify it down as much as possible. Mm-hmm. Answering the question bluntly, a man loses 90% of his male sexual response through circumcision. Wow. Simple as I can make it. Why is that? Because the foreskin is richly endowed in unique nerves that respond during sexual stimulation. So some of the nerves respond by being stretched. So when the foreskin is stretched, they trigger pleasurable sensations. Other nerves respond to being compressed. But both of those nerves working together give this deep,
sustained sensation of sexual response, but not one that leads to ejaculation. It's the sustained response. Now, the head of the penis is very sensitive as well. Okay, the foreskin contains the nerves that gives the deep, sustained sexual arousal sensations when the foreskin is stretched and compressed during intercourse. The head of the penis, on the other hand, contains the nerves that trigger ejaculation. So both of them work together to give a complete sexual experience. So when you remove the foreskin, you remove all the nerves that give the most pleasurable, deep, sustained sensations. So a circumcised man only has one sensation, the desire to ejaculate. And so that's why circumcised men are always fighting their own body. Oh no, I don't want to come yet. Oh no, it's too soon. I don't want to come right away. And so they're always thinking, oh no, I can't come. I don't want to come right away. And so it's not an enjoyable experience anymore. It's a fight against themselves because they've had 90% of their nerves removed. Once again, for religions and the circumcision industry, it's highly desirable because now they're going to buy delaying creams and all these other treatments for premature ejaculation. Premature ejaculation is an epidemic in the United States among younger circumcised men. So there's the first problem. Now, as you mentioned earlier, the second problem is that through exposure, you have the penis, which is an internal structure, mucous membrane. And during intercourse, the foreskin retracts, and the inside of the foreskin is mucous membrane. Mucous membrane touches the mucous membrane of the vagina. No skin touches the vagina. It's only mucous membrane. It's a beautiful design. However, in the circumcised penis, only skin touches the inside of the vagina. So you have skin touching mucous membrane. It's incompatible. The bacteria with the mucous membrane are incompatible with the skin bacteria. Skin bacteria are incompatible with the mucous membrane bacteria. So you have skin bacteria being deposited deep into the vagina, which is the reason why women with circumcised partners have higher rates of yeast infections and UTIs than women with intact partners. Right? So this, again, is a highly desirable thing for the circumcision industry because now you have millions of women buying canestin and antibiotics, which normal women with normal partners wouldn't have to buy.
Right.
Once again, it's profit. So, and now let's go back to the older men. As the keratinization and callousness of the head of the penis proceeds, as the man ages, so as the man ages, then you get layer upon layer of callus forming on the head of his penis, totally unnatural for a mucous membrane. No one ever say that you can remove a person's cheeks to dry out their tongue to improve their sense of taste. But that's exactly what the circumcision industry is telling you. By removing the foreskin, you somehow improve sex. It's garbage. It's complete rubbish. So as the man ages, his penis becomes less and less and less sensitive. So in older men, paradoxically, while they suffered from premature ejaculation as teenagers and in their 20s, they now suffer from the inability to ejaculate in their 50s. And then their partners really feel the full impact of circumcision because these desensitized men are desperate trying to orgasm, and they grab you and pound you like an oil well, and they're trying desperately to orgasm. One of my friends described sex with her husband when she was in her 50s as torture, that he would position her on the pillows in the exact position, and then he would say to her, "Now don't move," and then he would proceed to pound her. And if she moved, he would go, "Oh, you moved. You've just wrecked it for me." And he would try to orgasm. And it was a major feat if he managed to orgasm. That is the product of circumcision. The pain for both partners, destruction of the sexual response. It's a really...
imagine, I can only imagine that as a man that is, thrusting with that much force, ideally he's trying to ram his head, because that's the part that's feeling of him, right? Of the penis. Right. And he's trying to actually force feeling into it by ramming it into the cervix, the uterus, that area exactly. Of the woman, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I've encountered women who only had circumcised partners, and they thought, since they didn't have any other experience, they thought that's the way sex was meant to be. A man pounding away at them, treating them like an object. But then after their divorce, they would have their first intact boyfriend, And it would be a completely different experience where the man was gliding gently inside of them, and they felt like they were melting together in a beautiful union, with the foreskin providing lubrication and internal stimulation of the vagina instead of abrasion. And they're having first-time orgasms during intercourse alone, which had never happened to them before, and then experiencing Gspot response, right? So having clitoral and Gspot orgasms at the same time, all effortlessly. The man able to climax anytime he wanted, and the woman climaxing with him. That's the way sex was meant to be. And they say, why would anyone do this to a man to destroy his sexual response? It's just insane. It really is insanity.
Well, I do want to insert there for our listeners, though, that even if you do sleep, I noticed that you like to call it an intact male. An intact male, from your perspective, is somebody who, still has retained their foreskin. Right. And for me personally, I mean, I work with agricultural. So when you say an intact male, I think of honestly, the gonads, the balls, in agricultural, a neutered animal is someone that cannot have, or an animal that cannot have, reproduce. And then an intact male would be, a bull or a horse or a dog or a cat that is capable of reproducing. So I trip up over that one. But I think it's important, though, to really bring to focus here, too, that, you don't just automatically have a G-spot orgasm or automatically have an orgasm, clitoral or otherwise, as a woman, and perhaps even as a man, just because you happen to have your foreskin or you don't have your foreskin. I think there's so much at play there, but that I think what we're trying to say, or what you're trying to say, more to the point, is that it has a deeper resonance or deeper feeling for those who have not had, who have not been circumcised.
Yeah. So Rayanne, let me stress that I speak as an epidemiologist,
right?
And everything in epidemiology is probability, statistics.
Okay.
Right. So you can have a foreskin and never give pleasure to your partner. She'll never have an orgasm. Yeah. Or you can be circumcised and your partner always orgasms, right? What we're talking about is probability, statistically. Right. Statistically, if you look at millions and millions of women, a woman is 10 times more likely to have an orgasm with an intact man. That doesn't mean she can't have an orgasm with a circumcised man. It's just less likely.
Well, the only reason I really brought it up is because I had a boyfriend who was intact, as you like to say. And I can honestly say that, no, I never once had an orgasm. In the 2 years that we were together, I never once had a G-spot or clitoral stimulation. And, that a lot of that, though, was psychological. A lot of that,
exactly. That's a good point. It was all psychological because you were not predisposed to orgasm with it.
No, exactly. And so, and there was a lot more going on there than just, the physical things that were taking place. So I just wanted to make a point of saying that. Just
that's a very, very good point.
If they haven't had an orgasm with an intact male or not intact male, however you want to phrase it, that's not, that's not just because of that there's other things that need to be taken into account on that matter. And there,
I part of my work is teaching women how to have G-spot response.
Yes, I do know.
Yes. And I've worked with a number of women who are in their late 50s and have never, ever had a G-spot response. And they say, oh, no. I've experienced everything. I've had sex in every position you can imagine. It's never happened. Never it's going to happen. I said, well, do you give me permission to touch you and show you? Okay, you can do anything you want. Nothing's going to happen. And yet 5-10 seconds later, they're spraying all over because their body needed to do this. Just was a question of technique.
Yeah,
right?
Definitely. And I think it's a technique that needs to be taught, which you do offer. You do teach this technique, not just in your book, but you also do one-on-one sessions with women and couples and men.
And let me stress that I teach this not for sexual purposes, even though it does have sexual applications. I teach it for health reasons.
Yes.
Women, I believe, in my opinion, in my professional epidemiological opinion, I believe that women who ejaculate regularly are healthier.
No, I 100% agree with you. And speaking from personal experience, I myself have worked with Paul on this. And there also, I think that there's a lot of our muscle memory contains trauma as well. And so for those of us out there who have experienced abuse or exploitation, that we hold a lot of trauma. And I know when I first met you, Paul, and we began down this journey to help me release trauma and to release the lymphatic fluid, I had been to see another therapist beforehand, and we were discussing, what I thought was weight gain, and I was really confused by it. And when they touched down on my stomach, it was so interesting because what they said to me is they said, well, no, Rand, that doesn't feel like fat. That's fluid. That's really bizarre that that's fluid. And then I was seeking advice from another person, and they said to me, oh, you need to go and you need to get a lymphatic massage. You have an accumulation. Your central nervous system is shutting down, and you have an accumulation of lymphatic fluid that's doing some damage. And about a year and a half, 2 years later is when I met you. And after, not the first session, but after our second session, when I purged, I can't even remember how much lymphatic fluid that it was, but when I purged it, there was a noticeable difference in my stomach because the fluid had been purged out. And I felt better as a result of it. And some of the things that came up for me, the trauma that came up when I purged it was very, very surprising to me.
That's a very good point, Rayanne, that I should be amplified for our listeners.
Yes, please.
And that is that there's a direct link between the Gspot and the amygdala, the emotional center of the brain. So when people such as yourself are deeply traumatized for years and years and years, you store that trauma in the amygdala and also in the surrounding soft tissues of your body.
Right?
And so when you go for psychotherapy, they can address the mental trauma, but they cannot address all the trauma stored deeply in the amygdala and also deeply in the soft tissues of the areas that have been abused. In your case, genitals, lower abdomen, right? And anyway, so you might remember the second time that we had our session and you had your first real powerful ejaculation, you had very, very deep sobbing release of emotion. You remember that?
Oh,
right? That's extremely common in people. Yeah, it was like you were sobbing like a way you've never cried before. And matter of fact, you told me you hadn't cried in years. And this was the amygdala opening up and releasing this trauma that had been stored there for decades and releasing it all in one go. And you said it was like quite a decongesting experience and very healing, right?
It was.
And so I see Gspot purging as a very powerful therapy that can be combined with psychotherapy and other forms of therapy to give a complete healing experience.
And I really want to comment on your professionalism in when this was happening, in that you were there to support me, but you also gave me the space to grieve on my own. And it was surprising again, and I can't state that enough, that I was shocked by what came up. And then every session afterwards, something else came up. And I want to touch down too, because I know that when you're doing these sessions, you personally have traveled to, I believe it was India, and you did study in tantric as well as the healing modalities to help support people when you are helping them to discover this new release. Can you touch down on that some more?
Yeah. What happened in Tibet was quite a tragedy. In 1957, the Dalai Lama and thousands of his closest followers left Tibet because living there had become impossible with the Chinese occupation. And they went and reestablished themselves in northern India. And so that if you want to go study Tibetan yoga or ancient Tibetan lore, knowledge, you have to go to India now, not Tibet. And there I learned how to harness my internal energy, generate my internal energy, and then harness it and direct it into my patients. So I was trained in traditional massage therapy when I was studying in Europe. And I also learned about deep transverse therapy for healing athletic injuries. But at the same time, I also learned how to direct my internal energy into my patients to catalyze the healing process. And I believe that you felt that when I worked with you. You could feel the energy flowing into you. And at the end of a session, I'm like covered in sweat and exhausted because I put so much energy into my patients. It's not just a physical thing. It's a spiritual thing in many ways. And much of it can't be explained by science. It comes from 5,000-year-old Tibetan knowledge that I managed to get from one of the last remaining masters who knew how to do it. Yeah. So to summarize what you just said, and that is that among our listeners are many women who've been raped and been traumatized in their life. And this offers hope because people who just go for psychotherapy feel that something is missing because it doesn't address the trauma that's in the soft tissues. And so deep transverse therapy, along with Gspot response, lymph purging, addresses all of the issues of trauma, the mental, spiritual, psychological, physical. All aspects of the trauma are then released and purged. And people say they feel like they've been reborn as the person they were meant to be, not the traumatized individual that was left after the rape or the aggression.
So I'd like to ask you there, because you helped devise such a magnificent release for women in the areas of men who have experienced trauma due to circumcision and or sexual abuse or exploitation, because you have experienced all three. What are some actionable steps that you took that might help some of our listeners?
Well, the first thing I did, I was lucky in this case, is I met a woman from Japan when I was in university who was a daughter of a tantric master. So she started me on the path of tantra. And so that was very healing for me. So the tantric exercises, which I describe in my book, by the way, that was the first step. The second step is the German word is Gestalt, wholeness, restoring wholeness, is that I never saw myself as a circumcised man. I never accepted it. I never saw myself. Matter of fact, when I had dreams of my body, I always was an intact man. And then let me just quickly say, intact in this case applies to a man who still has his foreskin. We're talking about the husbandry aspect of castrating cattle, right? However, I discourage anyone from using the term which is used by the circumcision industry as uncircumcised. It's a very insulting term. It should never be used. It's an insult. How would you like, Ryan, if someone called you unmastectomied? You'd be offended, right? And that's exactly.
I'd be like, well, that's a medical term, and I don't associate anything with it. So,
Yeah, but it's similar. It's uncircumcised implies that circumcised is the proper form, and that uncircumcised is unusual. It's actually the opposite. Language is powerful.
Yes, it is.
And feminists have rightfully pointed this out, that language is powerful. And that's why they've worked to restructure our language to be more inclusive.
Spell, right?
Say again?
Language, words create spells, and spells is what
exactly
the universe to create our reality. So
for example, if you say the word policeman, you're implying that only a man can occupy that position. Where if you law enforcement officer, you now imply that both genders are equally capable of performing the job properly. Okay. And that's the way it should be. So uncircumcised is an insult, and men should consider it an insult. But that's why I use the word intact, or you can use the word natural, whole, complete. These are other terms that can be used for intact men. So getting back to our other argument, yes, trauma is a very important component of repressed memories. Repressed memories are directly related to trauma that's stored in the body. And I've worked intensively in my life to help people relieve trauma. So I can talk about case studies of my patients without identifying them, of course, for confidentiality reasons. I met a woman who was smiling at a conference. I met her at a conference. She was smiling. And I said, "Why are you in such pain?" I could see her pain and through her smile. She goes, "How did you notice that? How did you know?" And it turned out that she'd been gang raped as a 17-year-old girl by a motorcycle gang. And she carried this trauma for 20 years. Mm-hmm. And She was a yoga instructor. She was healthy, organic living, but she carried this trauma in her lower abdomen and genitals. It just couldn't get rid of it no matter what she did. And she'd been to smudging sessions, she's shamans, and nothing seemed to help. And I said, well, I can help you. Let's do some lymph purging. And so I did deep transverse therapy on her in the soft tissues that had been affected. Then I did lymph purging, and something really interesting happened. That night she was violently ill, vomiting, diarrhea, whatever. These were the toxins that had stored in the soft tissue that were being expelled by the lymph purging.
Right.
And then the second time I treated her, she was mildly ill. And then the third time she was said, oh my God, I feel like a 20-pound weight has just been taken off of my abdomen. Even in fact, she hadn't lost any weight at all, but it was the sensation of decongestion, removing the trauma that she'd carried. And since then, she has been an advocate of lymph purging to all of her students. And so there's a case study of someone who was significantly helped by this treatment.
But for men, what can men do to help with, to take actionable steps towards releasing their own trauma?
We were leading to that answer.
Yeah.
Okay, so yes, what can men do? Deep transverse therapy is really good to removing trauma from soft tissues. Okay. Obviously, men ejaculate, so they're already purging, right? But however, that's not sufficient. The best thing that men can do is to undergo foreskin restoration procedures. So there's surgical procedures and there's manual procedures. And I recommend the manual procedures. Just try manual first before you go for surgery. And then, so you can just go online and look at foreskin restoration. And there's a whole bunch of techniques that work very well. There's over 2 million men in the United States have successfully restored their foreskin. And by doing that, you can now restore your wholeness. You now restore a large amount of your sexual function. When I had my foreskin restored, the first thing that happened is sheets of callus fell off the head of my penis because the head of my penis was no longer being irritated by clothing. Right. And so it was no longer needed. The foreskin protected the head of the penis for the first time in years. And then sheet after sheet of dry, dead skin fell off the head of my penis, which was the callus buildup from years of contact with clothing, fell off. And then what I was left with was really highly sensitive mucous membrane once again. So all the sensation in the head of my penis was restored. And then strangely enough, many of the nerves grew back in the restored foreskin. And then I got much of my sexual function restored. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And then I said the first time I had sex after restoration, my partner had her first Gspot orgasm. Never happened before.
Right.
And then she started to have orgasms just from intercourse. Never happened before. Right. So then that's how I discovered this, because I can say with absolute certainty, if a man who was circumcised as an infant says, oh, I was circumcised and it didn't hurt me, he doesn't know what the hell he's talking about.
Well, that's that subconscious.
He has never experienced real sex. He's lost 90% of his sexual response and he doesn't even know it.
That's really something to think about. I mean, that's something that's that's a lot to take in, Paul. Absolutely.
Yeah. So what I encourage men to do what I did: sue the people who circumcised you. Use the courts. Don't use violence. Be peaceful, but sue the hell out of them because they took something vital to your masculinity. This was your birthright as a man to have a foreskin. It's an integral part of your whole identity. And this was stolen from you without your consent. Sue the bastards who did this to you, right? And if you get 100 million men suing, the whole edifice, the whole rotten thing will collapse.
I think that's, I can't comment on what's right for other people, which is why we're doing the podcast is, here we're just here to present you with new information. We're here to present you with actionable steps that you can take towards your own advancement, your own peace of mind, just living your best life.
Rayanne, we're having a conversation. I want to ask you a question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Why did you know many of the people who raped you, right?
Mm-hmm.
why don't you charge them with rape? Because there's no statute of limitations for sexual assault. Why don't you charge them?
Why don't I charge them? To be honest with you, there's a lot of reasons for that. And number one, I don't hold any anger in my heart for what happened to me. I don't, for me, I look at it as in that experience put me on the path to where I am now. I look at it and maybe this has to do with my spirituality. It might have to do with my belief system as far as, what we come here to do, the experiences that we bring into our lives due to the vibration that we emit, due to our thought patterns, due to behavioral patterning that was introduced to us as children. And so when I think about the people that raped me then, to go after them now, really in my head, that serves no purpose. The greatest purpose that I can be a part of is to help change the system. And for me, compassion is about the encompassment of understanding that people need correction, not punishment. And so to go back now 20 years later and issue a punishment for their actions, to me, that's a personal vendetta versus speaking out about my experience and sharing my journey towards self-empowerment. That benefits humanity as a whole. And I just see that my energy is just better. It just serves the world better for me to help change what's happening and not to go back and try to undo something. And that's
a very good explanation. That's very well said.
Thank you. But again, that's me, and I can't speak, but I've also done a great amount of healing. And in the beginning, I won't lie about it. In the beginning, I did not go after them. I did not charge them out of sheer fear, out of fear of ostracization from the community, which was my high school, out of fear of bringing unwanted attention, out of fear of having disappointed or the potential of disappointing the people that loved me. I was uncomfortable. I didn't want to cause any problems. And also I was afraid of what it said about me, would it be turned on me? And, 20 years ago, yeah, it was turned on me. All the things that I was afraid of did happen in their own way, which is what led to prostitution. But so yeah, 20 years ago, it was fear. Today, why I don't go after them is just purely because of my, where I stand about my understanding of compassion. And all I can do is, say that, yeah, absolutely. I pray for them. Absolutely. I have forgiven them. I have, forgiven myself. And that was a big part of also my healing, was that forgiveness for them and for myself. And again, stretching my energy and moving forward to help be of service to other people. But that's not the right path for everybody, just the same as for you suing the government and bringing that to the awareness of the people and encouraging other people in order to bring an end to male infant circumcision. Suing is one of the ways for you that you were able to find peace and that you were able to bring healing into your life. So what's right for one isn't always right for another, but I encourage everybody to follow what feels good to them.
Buddha said that if you do not forgive those who trespass against you, then you are the one that's going to suffer. You're the one that's going to carry the burden, not them. So yes, I've forgiven the people who did this to me, but I didn't forgive the government who allowed it to happen. I went after the bureaucracy, the faceless bureaucracy that permitted this, which I think was a much better strategy.
Absolutely.
It would have done nothing just to go after the pawns who were just acting according to the paradigm that they were living in. I went after the creators of the paradigm, the patriarchy itself.
Yes. Well, and I do encourage that, which is why we're having conversations like what we're having today. It's let's address the core issues that are creating, the systemic the word just flew right out of my mouth. Symptoms is what I was going for. The symptoms of the wounds, and so that's what we're really trying to do is we want to address, and just say like some male aggression towards women in general can stem from, for some, not all, can stem from that early childhood trauma, which, if you look up, if you look at certain books like The Body Keeps the Score, those are the books that are going to really, send home the message that early childhood trauma does create problems later on in life. And it creates problems when it comes to your health, when it comes to your psychological health, your mental health, your emotional health, and your physical health. And that's what we're trying to address here, in this.
Yeah. If you look, once again, looking statistically, in general, high circumcising societies are highly violent societies. The highest violence in the world are in areas where high circumcision rates. The most peaceful parts of the world are those with low circumcision rates. For example, the lowest crime rates, the lowest murder rates, lowest rape rates are in Scandinavia, where circumcision is almost unknown. The highest rate of rape in the Western world is in the United States, a highly violent society. So that violence is expressed right from infancy. You're teaching. What are you teaching an infant when you circumcise them? You're teaching it's all right to perform violence on someone who's weaker than you, smaller than you, and helpless. That's a lesson, and many men internalize that.
Yeah, and I like that. That was a perfect word. That it is internalized, and I really do think it's important though to bring up the conversation that many parents, they are ignorant to this information, such as no different than the listeners here might be hearing this information for the first time, and so many of these acts they're not done. Parents not all parents aim to hurt their kids. They actually, they trust their medical advisors. They're trusting their religion. They're trusting in the people around them to guide them to do the right thing. And unfortunately, just capitalism has obviously cashed in on these methods, and they've made a business out of it. And so, much in the same way that, again, we were talking about how nutrition has been turned against us.
Can I just make a comment? Very quick comment. It's very important. I say it right now because you made a point. Okay, it is not capitalism here that's evil. What is evil here is the hijacking of capitalism for personal gain.
There you go. Thank you.
Capitalism is based on a system of free trade. I have something you need, you have something I need. We freely trade voluntarily. That's what capitalism was meant to be. Not forcing and tricking people into mutilating others for personal profit. That's not capitalism.
Well,
that's mercantilism.
Isn't that funny then how that word now, because I did not know that, my association with capitalism has always been exploitation, but also that could stem from my own personal experience of being exploited. But it's interesting how it has moved away from its original intention, and like you're saying, it's the exploitation for personal gain that's turned it into that. And I think that was a really eloquent point to make.
Remember the Bill of Rights and the Constitution of the United States, which form the framework for capitalism, says every human being has the right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Right? What that means is the right to bodily integrity, to not have parts of your body stolen by someone else for personal profit. That's nothing to do with capitalism. That is exploitation. That is slavery. That is mercantilism. So people use the word capitalism as a bad word, and it's because it's been hijacked by people who have a personal agenda. And it's really sad that that's happened, because when capitalism works at its best, it's created more wealth for more people than any other system on earth. Is it perfect? No, it isn't. It's got a lot of flaws, but it's better than a lot of the alternatives.
Well, Paul, I am going to take this opportunity. Our phone call is actually breaking up, and the quality of audio is starting to disintegrate right now. So I think that's a perfect opportunity to cap that here, leave people with that information. And I'm definitely, I'd love to have you back because, I could keep talking about, I could talk about life with you forever. So I hope that you will come back and join us again.
Okay. I'm looking forward to our next podcast. Thank you very much. That was very thorough, and you're very professional.
Oh, well, I wouldn't go that far, but we're trying. Thank you so much for joining us here today, Paul. I really appreciate it.
We're all learning, and we're all getting better each time we do this. So thank you very much for investing your life and your time in order to do this.
Oh, thanks. Thank you so much for the acknowledgement. That means a lot to me. I appreciate it.
Okay, so have a really good day, and I give my regards to all our listeners. Thank you for listening in, and I hope we gave you some ideas to think about today.
Yes,
and do research on your own. You'll go online and research the points that we've raised and see for yourself the details of the issue.
Yes, and I'm going to go ahead, everybody, if you want to go to the show notes on the website, they will be there on how you can learn or where you can learn more, how you can take some actionable steps. And if you want to get in contact with Dr. Paul Tinari, we will have all of his information there for you to be able to reach him directly.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent.
Thanks. Bye, Paul.
Bye.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not necessarily reflect the opinions or viewpoints of the host, producer, other guests, or sponsors. I, Rayanne K. Irving, am not, nor have I ever been, a doctor or therapist, and none of what I say is intended for professional or medical advice.